In 1881, 25 men sailed into the Arctic for science. They were not going there to fight a war or search for treasure. They were going to measure weather, magnetism, and the unknown frozen world. But 3 years later, only 6 of them would come home alive. The expedition was led by Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, an officer in the United States Army Signal Corps. Their mission was part of the first International Polar Year, a global effort to study the Arctic. On paper, it sounded organized and noble. But in reality, these men were walking into one of the deadliest environments on Earth. Their destination was Lady Franklin Bay, far north on Ellesmere Island. At that time, this region was almost a blank space on the map. The men knew it would be cold and dangerous, but they believed relief ships would bring food, supplies, and a safe way home. After dropping them in the Arctic, the ship left. That was normal for polar expeditions. The plan was simple: survive the winter, collect scientific data, then wait for resupply. But in the Arctic, a simple plan can fall apart very fast. The men built their base at Fort Conger, often called Camp Conger. At first, life there was difficult but manageable. They had shelter, supplies, instruments, and a clear mission. They recorded weather, explored the land, and tried to prove that Americans could survive in the far north. The first winter was brutal, but the men survived it. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, darkness lasted for months, and isolation pressed on everyone. Still, they had food and structure. At this point, most of them probably believed the worst was behind them. Then, they waited for the relief ship. According to the plan, supplies were supposed to arrive and keep the expedition alive. Every sound, every distant shape on the horizon could have meant rescue, but the Arctic gave them silence. No ship reached them. Ice blocked the route. Bad weather and poor planning turned delay into danger. The men were still alive, but now their future depended on decisions being made hundreds of miles away by people who did not truly understand their situation. The Arctic ice was not just scenery, it was a wall. It crushed ships, blocked passages, and made rescue almost impossible. In 1882, the relief effort failed. In 1883, another ship was crushed by ice before it could reach Greely's men. Back at camp, supplies began to matter more than courage. Every meal had to be counted. Every box of food became a lifeline. The men had done their scientific work, but science could not feed them. Their biggest enemy was no longer the cold. It was time. A second winter in the Arctic changed everything. The men were tired, isolated, and unsure if anyone was coming. Their bodies were weakening, and their trust in the rescue plan was breaking. Staying alive became more important than the mission. Greely had orders: if no ship came, the party should move south towards supply caches. But the plan depended on those caches actually being there. Some supplies were missing, some were too far away, and some had never been placed properly. The orders looked clear until men's lives depended on them. The deadliest mistake was not one single decision. It was a chain of failures: failed resupply, bad communication, crushed ships, and unrealistic expectations. Each mistake alone was dangerous. Together they trapped 25 men in a frozen world with almost nothing left. In August 1883, Greely and his men left Fort Conger and moved south. They hoped to find supplies and get closer to rescue. But leaving shelter was a gamble. They were carrying what they could, crossing ice and water, not knowing if food would be waiting. They dragged boats, sledges, instruments, records, and food through a landscape that punished every step. The men were not explorers chasing glory anymore. They were survivors trying to move before winter closed around them again. The journey south was exhausting. Ice drifted. Boats became difficult to use. Weather slowed them down. Every mile cost energy they could not replace. They were moving toward hope, but also toward a place where there might be no real help at all. Storms hit them hard. Snow, wind, freezing spray, and shifting ice turned movement into suffering. The men were already weak, and the Arctic did not give them time to recover. Each storm stole warmth, strength, and morale. Hunger slowly changed them. Strong men became slow. Simple tasks became impossible. Carrying supplies, setting up tents, even walking through snow became a battle. In survival stories, people often imagine one dramatic moment. But starvation is slower. It takes a person piece by piece. By the time they reached Cape Sabine, their food situation was desperate. The supplies they expected were not enough. Some caches were missing or unreachable. The men now had to stretch tiny rations through an Arctic winter, and nobody knew if rescue would arrive in time. Going back was no longer realistic. The distance was too great, the men were too weak, and winter was coming. They were trapped between the ice and the sea, with almost no food. Cape Sabine became their last chance, and almost their grave. They built a new camp at Cape Sabine, later known as Camp Clay. It was not a strong base like Fort Conger. It was a desperate shelter made by men who had run out of good options. They were now living on hope, discipline, and shrinking rations. Cape Sabine was supposed to bring them closer to rescue. Instead, it became the place where the expedition collapsed. The men were hundreds of miles from safety, surrounded by ice, darkness, and hunger. If a ship did not come soon, no amount of bravery would save them. Then the Arctic darkness closed in. Long nights, freezing temperatures, and hunger made every day feel heavier. Inside the shelter, the men waited, counted food, and listened to the wind. Outside, there was nothing but snow, ice, and silence. Rations became painfully small. One meal a day was not enough for men fighting Arctic cold. Their bodies needed calories to stay warm, but the food was almost gone. Every bite became a decision: eat now or survive a little longer tomorrow. Hunger changed the camp. It changed conversations, moods, and trust. Men who had worked together for years now watched the food stores with fear. In extreme survival, hunger does not just attack the body, it attacks judgment. In January 1884, the first death came. After that, the deaths continued. Starvation, cold, exhaustion, and sickness moved through the camp. Each loss made the survivors weaker, not only physically, but mentally. They were watching their own future happen in front of them. The list of living men kept getting shorter. Names that had once belonged to friends, explorers, and soldiers became entries in a death record. The expedition had started with 25 people. Now survival depended on lasting just a little longer than the next man. Spring came, but rescue still did not. Imagine surviving winter, thinking help must finally be close, and seeing nothing. No ship, no smoke, no voices, just the same empty horizon. For the men at Cape Sabine, hope became harder to believe. They wrote notes, kept records, and tried to preserve the truth of what was happening. Greely continued to document the disaster even as his men were dying. These records later helped the world understand how a scientific mission became a tragedy. Food theft became a serious problem. In normal life, stealing food is a crime. In a starving camp, it can become a death sentence for everyone else. When one man took extra food, it meant another man might not live through the week. Greely faced a terrible decision. Private Charles Henry had been caught stealing food more than once. The camp was starving, discipline was collapsing, and supplies were almost gone. Greely gave an order. If Henry stole again, he would be shot. Henry was caught again. In June 1884, just days before rescue, he was executed for stealing food. It remains one of the darkest moments of the expedition. The men were not living like normal soldiers anymore. They were starving people trapped at the edge of survival. After that, the camp became even quieter. There was no victory in what happened. No one had truly won. The survivors were surrounded by death, guilt, hunger, and fear. They were still alive, but barely. By mid-June, only a few men were still alive. They were too weak to hunt, too weak to travel, and almost too weak to hope. The rescue ships were finally moving north, but the question was simple. Would they arrive before the last survivors died? The survivors were frozen, starving, and close to death. Some could barely move. Some were wrapped in blankets, waiting for the end. They had survived years in the Arctic, but now the final hours mattered more than all the years before. When rescuers finally found them, some survivors were believed to be less than 2 days from death. That is how close it was. After years of suffering, the difference between rescue and total disaster came down to hours. Then, at last, a ship appeared. On June 22, 1884, the rescue expedition reached Cape Sabine. For the men still alive, that distant ship was not just transport. It was the difference between becoming another name on the death list and seeing home again. The rescuers found a scene of extreme suffering. They brought food, warmth, medical care, and human voices from the outside world. But the rescue was not a celebration at first. It was shock. The men they found were barely recognizable. Out of the 25 people who went north, only 7 were found alive at Cape Sabine: Greely and 6 of his men. The rest had died from starvation, cold, drowning, or the brutal decisions forced by survival. The survivors were skeletal, frostbitten, and extremely weak. Some could barely speak. Their bodies had been pushed far beyond normal limits. The rescuers were not just saving explorers, they were saving men who had been reduced to the last edge of life. Even after rescue, the tragedy was not over. One of the rescued men, Sergeant Joseph Ellison, died after suffering severe frostbite. So although 7 were found alive, only 6 ultimately returned home. 6 survivors came back from an expedition of 25. That number shocked the public. What began as a proud scientific mission ended as one of the most horrifying survival stories in Arctic history. When the news reached America, people were stunned. Newspapers reported starvation, failed rescue efforts, discipline problems, and death. The public wanted heroes, but they also wanted someone to blame. Some saw Greely and his men as heroes who endured the impossible. Others questioned the planning, the orders, and the leadership behind the mission. Was this a story of courage or a story of preventable failure? The answer was not simple. Then came the darkest controversy. Some recovered remains showed signs that desperate men may have cut flesh after death. The public reacted with horror. The survivors denied the worst accusations, and the full truth became difficult to separate from rumor and newspaper sensationalism. The Greely expedition became more than a survival story. It became a story about secrecy, shame, and what humans might do when every normal rule disappears. The Arctic did not just test their bodies, it tested morality itself. The Arctic did not care about rank, courage, science, or good intentions. It punished mistakes without emotion. One missed supply ship, one broken plan, one bad assumption, and 25 men were left fighting a world that never forgave weakness. 25 men went north, 6 came home. That simple number explains the whole tragedy. The expedition collected valuable scientific data, but the cost was almost unimaginable. History remembered the mission, but it remembered the suffering even more. Exploration often looks heroic from far away. Maps get filled in, records are broken, and nations celebrate. But behind those achievements are real people, real hunger, real fear, and sometimes terrible decisions made in places where help is too far away. So here's the question. If you were trapped in the Arctic, starving, freezing, and watching rescue fail again and again, how long would you hold on? Would you still believe help was coming, or would the silence break you first?